that the state of Minnesota has introduced the Future Fuels Act, which is the very first clean fuel standard in the Midwest, there are some questions that have been asked of the American Coalition for Ethanol regarding the differences between the Midwest approach and the approach that's been taken in California over the last 10 years. And I think it's really important for our members to know that there was really a threshold ground rule that ACE had before we even engaged in the discussions in the Midwest about a clean fuel standard. And that was that we needed this program to look very different than California in some very significant ways before we were willing to work on it. And I'm really happy to report that over the course of the last 3 years, we've been able to work with a very diverse group of stakeholders to design a program in the Midwest that's embodied by the Minnesota Future Fuels Act that is indeed different than California. The first way it's different, and perhaps the most important way for the ethanol industry that the Midwest approach is different, is that we would absolutely promote and allow E15 and other mid-level blends. I think a lot of people know that California has a very hot E85 market. E85 use is quadrupled under the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, but California prohibits E15. It's either E10 or E85 in the state of California. No E15, no mid-level blends. California is in the process of hopefully revisiting that prohibition on E15, but we don't have that problem in the Midwest, not in Minnesota or any other Midwest state. E15 and mid-level blends are allowed and in fact embraced by a lot of the motorists out there. And it's also important to note that we did some modeling to really determine how could a Midwest state achieve a carbon reduction, say a 15 or 20% carbon reduction in their transportation fuels over a period of time. And the quickest way to get there, the lowest cost way for a Midwest state to get there, is actually by rapidly increasing the use of E15, E30, and E85. And so the Midwest approach, most importantly, is different than the California approach when it comes to clean fuel policy, in that it would support and promote E15 and higher blends. The second way that a Midwest approach is different than the California approach is that we've insisted from day one, and this conversation has taken place behind the scenes for nearly 3 years. We've insisted from day one that we take a technology neutral approach in the Midwest, meaning let the marketplace sort out who the winners are when it comes to low carbon technologies. Let's not have the government or regulators like the Air Resources Board in California predetermine who the winners will be. The California program is not technology neutral, not by any stretch of the imagination right now. The California program is tilted in favor of electric vehicles. There's no doubt about it. We've been able to hold a very diverse coalition of groups together in the Midwest, including environmental groups, who have embraced the fact that we are going to be technology neutral. This principle is embodied in the legislation in the state of Minnesota. And I think an interesting point I'd like to share is that during the first 2 committee hearings on the Future Fuels Act in Minnesota, there's only been one voice in opposition or resistance to the legislation, and that's been from the Sierra Club. And the reason the Sierra Club doesn't support the Midwest clean fuel standard that we're pushing is that they want it to favor electric vehicles. They would prefer the California approach. They don't like that it's a technology neutral piece of legislation. And so they're advocating for something very different, the California approach in the Midwest, and that's not the approach we're taking. The third reason or way, I guess, the Midwest Clean Fuels Standard legislation is very different than the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard is that we would insist and have been insisting upon the use of the very latest life cycle science when it comes to determining the carbon intensity of various transportation fuels, and specifically the latest GREET model determined or developed by the Department of Energy's Argonne National Laboratory. Under the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, CARB uses GREET when they feel like it, and they sort of cherry pick life cycle science in other instances. For example, CARB uses a wildly outdated assumption about land use change, assessing a penalty of nearly 20 grams against corn ethanol's carbon footprint. The latest GREET model would suggest that land use change results in maybe 3 or 4 grams in terms of a carbon penalty, if you will. And so just by using the latest GREET model, corn ethanol is much cleaner and represented as such in the legislation. And the final way that the Midwest approach is different than the California approach is that we would absolutely reward farmers for climate smart practices that are taking place already and will take place in the future to help drive down the carbon intensity of corn ethanol. The California program currently prohibits any credit value, any carbon credits from going back to farmers for practices that result in lower carbon ethanol. CARB is right now looking at perhaps allowing for more efficient use of nitrogen to be credited somehow under the California program, but it's going to take them a while to get there. We specify in the Minnesota legislation in the Future Fuels Act that credit value must go back to farmers for practices that sequester carbon in the soil, whether that's no-till or low-till practices, or practices that result in more efficient use of nitrogen. All of these practices help reduce the carbon intensity of corn ethanol. And ultimately, by designing a program that's decidedly different in the Midwest than in California, we're going to ensure that there's more value out there for corn ethanol in the marketplace in the future, and that there's more demand for corn ethanol in the future.